The police officer sat in his cruiser, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he followed the dark blue sit-in. It had been a quiet night, too quiet for his liking. 6 hours into his shift, he'd only written 2 tickets, and his supervisor had been pushing the whole department to increase their community engagement numbers this month. He'd noticed the sit-in a few blocks back. Something about it caught his eye, though he couldn't spot any actual traffic violations. The car was well maintained, moving at exactly the speed limit, and the driver seemed to be following every rule in the book. Maybe that's what made him suspicious. It all seemed too perfect. The officer ran the plates, but impatience got the better of him. Without waiting for the response, he flipped on his lights. He'd been on the force for 8 years, and he developed what he called a sixth sense about these things. His supervisor had talked to him before about his high number of stops, especially with certain drivers, but he always had his reasons ready. Better safe than sorry, he'd say in his reports. As he stepped out of his cruiser, he adjusted his utility belt and straightened his posture, trying to look as authoritative as possible. The beam from his flashlight swept across the sit-in's trunk, then along its side. Everything about the car looked ordinary, which somehow made him even more determined to find something wrong. "Evening," he called out, his voice carrying that edge of authority he perfected over the years. His hand rested casually near his weapon, a habit he developed early in his career. License and registration. Through the driver's window, he could see hands perfectly positioned on the steering wheel. Another detail that struck him as oddly professional. The interior light was already on, and the driver sat perfectly still, looking straight ahead. "Officer," the driver spoke calmly, his voice steady and controlled. "I'm going to reach for my identification now. It's in my inside jacket pocket." The officer's grip tightened slightly on his flashlight. Something about the driver's composure bothered him. Most people showed at least a little nervousness during traffic stops, but this guy seemed almost too calm. Slowly, the officer commanded, taking a half step back. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The driver moved with deliberate care, reaching into his jacket. The officer's flashlight beam followed every movement, casting harsh shadows across the car's interior. In the distance, a dog barked, breaking the tense silence of the suburban street. "Sir, could you explain why you're driving through this neighborhood at this hour?" the officer asked, his tone carrying an edge of suspicion. He'd stopped plenty of cars in this area before, always with the same explanation ready. "This is a high-traffic route, and we need to stay vigilant." The driver's hand emerged from his jacket, holding something that made the officer's eyes narrow. It wasn't just a regular wallet. It was a credential holder, the kind used by federal agents. But the officer had seen fake badges before, and his suspicion didn't waver. "I'll need you to hand that over," he said, his voice growing firmer. As he reached for the credentials, his radio crackled to life, the delayed response about the vehicle registration finally coming through. The officer froze mid-reach as the dispatcher's voice filled the night air with information that would completely change the direction of this routine traffic stop. His flashlight beam wavered slightly as the realization began to sink in. The perfect driving, the professional composure, the government plates he hadn't waited to verify. It all suddenly made sense, and not in the way he'd expected. In that moment, standing on the quiet suburban street, he felt the first droplets of sweat form on his forehead, knowing this stop was about to become anything but routine. The FBI agent kept his expression neutral as he watched the police officer examine his credentials under the harsh beam of the flashlight. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to read body language, and right now, the officers told a clear story of someone whose evening had just taken an unexpected turn. "These look," the officer started, then cleared his throat. "I'll need to verify these." His voice had lost some of its earlier edge, but there was still a hint of defiance there, as if he was trying to hold onto his authority even as it slipped away. "Of course," the agent replied calmly. "You can call it in. While you're at it, I'd like to know the reason for this stop." He spoke professionally, the way he would address a colleague, though they both knew this was far from a friendly professional encounter. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. A car passed by slowly, its driver rubbernecking at the scene. Just another traffic stop that looked routine from the outside, but was anything but ordinary on the inside. The agent's mind wandered briefly to similar stops over the years. Before joining the FBI, when he was just a young lawyer fresh out of school. During his first year as an agent, driving an unmarked car. Even last month, in his own neighborhood, off-duty. Each time, he'd remained professional, turned the other cheek, done everything by the book. But tonight felt different. "Sir," the officer spoke again, his tone notably more hesitant now. "I observed." He paused, struggling to find words that wouldn't dig his hole deeper. The dashboard camera was recording everything, and they both knew it. "You observed what, exactly?" the agent asked, his voice level but firm. "I'd like you to be very specific about what made you choose to follow my vehicle and then initiate this stop." He kept his hands on the steering wheel, even though every instinct told him to reach for his phone, and called his supervisor right then and there. The police radio crackled again, this time confirming what the credentials had already shown. The driver was indeed a senior FBI agent, the vehicle was federal, and the stop had just become a potential administrative nightmare. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir," the officer said quickly, trying to backtrack. "I was just doing my job, performing routine checks in the area." The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them, and they both knew it. The agent took a deep breath. He thought about his kids at home, how he taught them to handle difficult situations with grace, but also with courage. He thought about his responsibility, not just as a federal agent, but as someone who could actually do something about moments like this. "Officer," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of federal law enforcement experience, "I'm going to need your name and badge number. And I want you to understand something. This stop isn't ending here with just an apology." The streetlights cast long shadows across both their faces as the officer shifted uncomfortably. In the distance, another police car's siren wailed, heading somewhere else, handling some other situation. But right here, in this moment, two law enforcement officers faced each other across a divide that went far deeper than their different badges. "I'll also need a copy of the dashcam footage," the agent continued, his tone professional but unyielding. "Everything from when you first began following my vehicle. I'm sure dispatch has already notified your supervisor about this stop, but I'll be following up personally tomorrow morning." The officer's posture had completely changed from his confident stance earlier. Gone was the hand casually resting near his weapon, replaced by arms hanging uncertainly at his sides. The flashlight beam wavered slightly as the reality of the situation continued to sink in. This wasn't going to be just another traffic stop that would be forgotten by morning. This was going to be a moment of accountability, one that could potentially spark real change. The agent knew from experience that these moments, uncomfortable as they were necessary for progress. The next morning, the police station buzzed with unusual activity. The chief of police sat at his desk, rubbing his temples as he reviewed the dash cam footage for the third time. The stop had already made its way up the chain of command, with both the FBI field office and internal affairs requesting immediate meetings. Down the hall, the officer from last night sat alone in the break room, his coffee growing cold in front of him. His colleagues gave him a wide berth. Nobody wanted to be caught up in what was quickly becoming a departmental earthquake. The morning shift briefing had been tense, with whispered conversations stopping abruptly whenever he walked past. "The FBI agent is here," a secretary announced, poking her head into the break room. The officer's stomach tightened. He'd spent most of the night tossing and turning, replaying the traffic stop in his mind, trying to figure out how to explain his actions in a way that wouldn't end his career. In the chief's office, the FBI agent sat calmly, his posture relaxed but professional. He'd switched his suit from last night, now wearing a crisp navy blue one that seemed to emphasize his authority even more. On the desk between them lay a thick folder, the officer's complete service record. "Let's talk about patterns," the agent said, his voice steady. "In the past year alone, your officer has conducted over 300 traffic stops. The demographics of those stops tell an interesting story." He didn't raise his voice or show anger. He didn't need to. The numbers spoke loudly enough. The chief leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of concern. He'd been pushing for departmental reforms, but change had been slow. Now, with federal attention on his department, he knew things would have to move faster. "We've had conversations with him before about his stop rates," the chief admitted, shuffling through some papers. "He always has explanations. Claims it's about high-crime areas, suspicious behavior, routine patrols." "And you believed those explanations?" the agent asked, raising an eyebrow. He opened the folder, pointing to specific incidents. 3 months ago, he stopped a pediatrician heading home from an emergency shift. 2 weeks ago, a retired military officer. Last week, a high school principal. All with similar justifications, all followed the same pattern. Outside the office, officers gathered in small groups, talking in hushed tones. Word had spread quickly about the FBI's involvement, and everyone knew this wasn't going to be business as usual. Some defended their colleague, others shook their heads in disappointment, but all of them knew change was coming. The officer was finally called in. He changed into his dress uniform, hoping to project professionalism, but his usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. As he sat down, facing both his chief and the FBI agent, he realized this meeting wasn't just about last night. It was about every stop he'd ever made, every decision he tried to justify, every pattern he'd hoped nobody would notice. "Officer," the FBI agent began, "I'm not here to end your career." The words hung in the air, surprising everyone in the room. "I'm here to make sure you understand why last night happened, and to ensure it never happens again. Not to me, not to anyone else." The chief nodded slowly, pulling out a new document. "We're implementing immediate changes," he announced. "Additional training, weekly review of stop data, body camera audits, and community oversight panels." He turned to the officer. "And you'll be the first to go through all of it." The morning sun streamed through the office windows, casting long shadows across the desk covered in reports and statistics. In that moment, it wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It was about a chance for real change, sparked by one encounter that could no longer be explained away. Word traveled fast in the small city. Within days, local news vans parked outside the police station, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Reporters clutched coffee cups in the morning chill, hoping to catch anyone who might share details about the now famous traffic stop. Inside the station, things were changing. Officers gathered in the main conference room, the space transformed into a temporary classroom. At the front, an experienced civil rights attorney clicked through presentation slides, her voice firm but encouraging as she led discussions about bias and community trust. "Let's talk about what happened the other night," she said, addressing the room of officers. "Not to point fingers, but to understand why it happened and how we can do better." The room fell silent, all eyes focused forward. Some officers took notes, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but everyone paid attention. The officer from the traffic stop sat in the front row. The past few days had been a blur of meetings, interviews, and hard conversations. But something unexpected was happening. Instead of feeling defensive, he found himself really listening for the first time. During a break, he stood by the water cooler, overhearing 2 veteran officers talking. "Remember when we first started?" One said, "Nobody ever questioned our stops. Now everything's recorded, everything's reviewed." The other officer nodded, adding, "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Meanwhile, the FBI agent had been busy too. He sat in community meetings, sharing his experience not with anger, but with purpose. This isn't about one traffic stop. he explained to a packed room at the community center. It's about making sure every encounter between law enforcement and citizens is based on real reasons, not assumptions. People lined up to share their own stories. The businessman who got stopped 3 times in 1 month, the college student who took a longer route to avoid certain areas, the grandmother who worried every time her grandchildren drove at night. The agent listened to each one, taking notes, building a picture of patterns that couldn't be ignored. Back at the police station, the chief implemented new policies. Every traffic stop now required clear documentation of the reason before lights could be activated. Weekly reviews would look for patterns in stopping decisions. Body cameras had to be activated before officers left their vehicles, not just when they approached stopped cars. The officer who made the stop found himself in a unique position. Instead of being ostracized, he became part of the solution. "I can tell you exactly what I was thinking that night," he shared with his fellow officers during a training session. "And I can tell you exactly why I was wrong." Community members started showing up at police department meetings, not to protest, but to participate. They joined review boards, offered suggestions, and shared their experiences. Some officers were surprised to find that listening to the community didn't undermine their authority. It strengthened it. Local business owners got involved too. The coffee shop across from the station offered their space for informal meetings between officers and residents. Simple conversations over coffee began breaking down walls that had stood for years. The FBI agent watched these changes unfold with cautious optimism. One evening, as he finished another community meeting, a young officer approached him. That night, the officer said, "When you got stopped, you could have just filed a complaint and walked away. Why didn't you?" The agent thought for a moment, looking around at the room full of people working together for change. "Because sometimes," he replied, "the right response to a wrong isn't to punish, it's to prevent it from happening again." As the sun set outside, casting an orange glow through the station windows, officers from the next shift arrived for their briefing. They walked past new posters about community policing, past the updated mission statement that now included words like equality and accountability, and past meeting rooms where citizens and officers sat together, planning a better future. 3 weeks after the traffic stop, the internal affairs investigation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. 2 investigators sat in a dimly lit room surrounded by stacks of files and computer screens showing traffic stop data from the past 5 years. What started as a review of one officer's conduct had uncovered something much bigger. "Look at this pattern," said one investigator, pointing to a map on her screen. Red dots covered certain neighborhoods, showing where most stops occurred. It's not just about individual officers anymore. The whole system needs looking at. The FBI agent had been right. This was about more than one traffic stop on a quiet night. The investigation team discovered that some officers had been pressured to meet unofficial quota targets, leading them to make unnecessary stops in certain areas. Others had received praise and better assignments based on their high number of stops, creating an unspoken reward system. In the break room, officers discussed the changes happening around them. Some felt defensive, others relieved that long-standing issues were finally being addressed. "Remember last year," one veteran officer said, stirring his coffee, "when I tried to report something similar? Nobody wanted to hear it then." The police chief called an emergency meeting with city officials. The conference room was packed as he presented the investigation's findings. "We're not here to point fingers," he began, his voice firm but tired after long weeks of review. "We're here to fix what's broken." The city council members leaned forward in their chairs as statistics and graphs appeared on the screen. The numbers told a clear story, one that couldn't be explained away by coincidence or standard procedure. One council member, who had been skeptical of the need for change, sat back in his chair, shaking his head at the evidence before him. Meanwhile, the officer from the original stop had become an unexpected advocate for change. He started speaking to other departments about his experience, sharing how one traffic stop had opened his eyes. I used to think I was just doing my job, he told a room full of officers from neighboring cities. Now I understand the difference between doing the job and doing it right. The FBI agent received a call from his supervisor. Other field offices had heard about what happened and wanted to implement similar review processes. What started as one incident in one city was spreading, creating ripples of change across the region. Community leaders organized a town hall meeting to discuss the investigation's findings. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls. Instead of angry confrontations, the atmosphere was focused on solutions. Parents shared their fears about their children driving at night. Business owners talked about customers avoiding certain areas, and officers spoke honestly about the pressures they faced. One older resident stood up, her voice shaking slightly. "I've lived here 40 years," she said, "and this is the first time I've felt like both sides are really listening to each other." The room fell silent, many nodding in agreement. The investigation team worked late into the night, piecing together years of data. They found that some officers had tried to report problems before but were ignored or discouraged. Others had simply followed what they thought was expected of them, never questioning the patterns they were part of. As evening fell, the police chief sat in his office, reviewing the draft of a new department-wide policy. It would require regular data analysis of all stops, mandatory review of camera footage, and clear guidelines for when stops could be initiated. But more importantly, it would create a culture where officers felt comfortable reporting concerns without fear of backlash. Outside his window, he could see citizens and officers chatting in the parking lot after a community meeting. Something was changing in their city, something that started with one traffic stop but had grown into much more. The investigation wasn't just uncovering problems. It was building bridges that should have been built long ago. 2 months after the traffic stop, the changes really started taking root. The police department looked different now, not just in policies, but in how people worked together. The morning shift briefing had a new energy as officers gathered around, drinking coffee and discussing their latest community meetings. The local news station arrived early one morning to film a special report. Their cameras captured officers attending a new training session, where the focus wasn't just on law enforcement, but on understanding the community they served. The trainer, a respected community leader, shared real stories from residents. "Today's session isn't about blame," the trainer explained, standing before a room of attentive officers. "It's about understanding each other better." He clicked to a slide showing a family photo. "This could be any of our families. When they drive through our city, they should feel protected, not targeted." The officer from the traffic stop incident sat among his colleagues, now wearing a new badge, Community Relations Liaison. After his experience, he'd volunteered to help bridge the gap between the police and the public. His fellow officers, who once kept their distance, now sought his advice on handling sensitive situations. In the dispatch center, new protocols were in place. Every traffic stop was now logged with detailed reasons before officers could proceed. The dispatcher's screens showed a real-time map of where stops occurred, helping prevent over-policing in specific neighborhoods. The FBI agent visited regularly, working with the department to refine their reforms. During one visit, he noticed a wall of photos in the station's main hallway had been updated. Instead of just showing police achievements, it now displayed images of officers and citizens working together at community events. "Remember when we thought this would destroy the department?" the chief asked him during one meeting. "Turns out it made us stronger." They reviewed the latest statistics showing a significant drop in unnecessary stops, while serious crime prevention remained effective. The city council meeting that evening was packed. Citizens who'd never attended before now sat in the audience, ready to participate in their community's transformation. The council was voting on funding for new police training programs and community oversight committees. A young officer stood up to share her experience. "Last week," she began, "I almost made a stop based on old habits. But then I remembered our new training. I asked myself the right questions first. That's the difference these changes have made." The department's evidence room had been converted into a data analysis center. Computers tracked patterns in police activities, ensuring accountability and fairness. But more importantly, they showed progress. Fewer complaints, better community relations, and more effective law enforcement. Outside the station, the community notice board displayed upcoming events. Coffee with cops at local cafes, ride-along programs for residents, and youth mentorship opportunities. What started as mandatory reforms had grown into genuine community engagement. The officer who made the original stop now spent his breaks talking to rookie officers about that night. It's not just about following rules, he'd tell them. It's about understanding why the rules exist. His story had become a powerful teaching tool, showing how one incident could lead to positive change. At the end of a long day, the chief walked through the station, passing officers chatting with community members in the lobby. The walls now display posters about bias awareness and community partnership alongside the traditional police memorabilia. The change wasn't just in policies, it was in the air itself. "We're not perfect yet," he told a reporter doing a follow-up story, "but we're moving in the right direction." The cameras captured officers heading out for their evening patrol, each one carrying not just a badge and gun, but a new understanding of what it meant to serve and protect all members of their community. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. On a bright morning, the police station buzzed with unusual activity. Officers from neighboring cities filled the training room, notebooks ready, eager to learn about the changes that had made headlines across the state. The FBI agent stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. He'd given many presentations before, but this felt different. What happened that night could have ended with just a complaint, he began. Instead, it sparked something much bigger. The room fell silent, hanging on every word. In the audience, the officer from the traffic stop sat next to his chief. He'd come a long way from that night, now helping train other departments on avoiding the same mistakes. His story had become more than a cautionary tale. It was a blueprint for change. Last week, the agent continued, pulling up a slide with recent statistics. This department handled more serious crimes than ever before. Know why? He paused, looking around the room. Because they're not wasting time on unnecessary stops. They're building real relationships with the community. The presentation showed body camera footage from recent police interactions. Positive examples of officers handling difficult situations with new approaches. Each clip demonstrated how the department had transformed its way of working. During the lunch break, officers from different cities gathered in small groups, sharing their own experiences. One officer from a nearby town spoke up. "We thought these changes would make our job harder," he admitted. "But looking at your results, maybe we've been doing it the hard way all along." The chief stood up next, sharing how the department's culture had shifted. 6 months ago, our officers measured success by the number of stops they made, he explained. Now they measure it by the trust they build. He clicked to a slide showing community feedback scores. They had doubled in just half a year. In the back of the room, community leaders who'd helped shape the new policies watched with pride. They'd become regular visitors to the station, not to file complaints, but to work together on keeping their neighborhoods safe. The officer who made the stop shared his perspective next. "I used to think being a good cop meant being tough," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "Now I know it means being fair." His words hit home. Several officers nodded in understanding. After lunch, the training shifted to practical exercises. Officers role-played traffic stops, with community members providing feedback. The scenarios weren't just about what to do, they were about why it mattered. Every decision was discussed, every assumption challenged. The FBI agent watched from the side, remembering that night 6 months ago. He thought about how close they'd come to letting it become just another incident report. Instead, it had grown into something that was changing departments across the state. Near the end of the day, a young officer raised her hand. "But what about our safety?" she asked. Aren't we putting ourselves at risk by second-guessing every stop? The room tensed, waiting for the response. The chief stepped forward. Actually, he said, pulling up another chart, our officer injury rates are down 40% since we made these changes. Turns out, when people trust the police, everyone's safer. The numbers on the screen backed up his words. As the training wrapped up, officers exchanged contact information, eager to stay in touch and share their experiences implementing similar changes. The FBI agent overheard snippets of conversation. Officers planning community meetings, discussing new training ideas, sharing success stories. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Officers from different cities walked to their cars together, still deep in conversation. Something bigger than one department was happening here, a change that was spreading, one police force at a time. 1 year had passed since that night. The FBI agent pulled into the parking lot of the police academy, where a new class of recruits waited to hear him speak. As he walked through the halls, he noticed how different things felt from just a year ago. The academy's curriculum had been completely redesigned. Gone were the old-style lectures about authority and control. Instead, the walls displayed posters about community partnership and understanding. Today's lesson wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about making real change. Before I start, the agent said to the room full of fresh faces, I want you to close your eyes and imagine being pulled over. Not as officers, but as ordinary people. The recruits followed his instruction, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. That feeling you have right now, remember it. It'll make you better officers. In the back of the room sat the officer from that famous traffic stop, now an instructor at the academy. He'd found his true calling, teaching new officers how to avoid the mistakes he'd made. His story had become required learning for every recruit. A year ago, the agent continued, one traffic stop changed not just a department, but how we think about policing. He clicked through slides showing the positive changes: crime rates down, community trust up, police-citizen relationships stronger than ever. A young recruit raised her hand. But how do we know when to make a stop? We can't just stop nobody. The room grew quiet, waiting for the answer. The agent smiled. It was the question he'd hoped someone would ask. That's exactly right, he replied. We don't want you to stop nobody. We want you to stop the right people, for the right reasons. He shared real examples from the past year, showing how good police work actually improved when bias was removed from the equation. The officer-turned-instructor stepped forward to share his perspective. I used to make stops based on hunches, he admitted. Now I know that good police work is about facts, not feelings. The recruits scribbled notes, hanging on every word from someone who'd lived both sides of the story. During the break, the agent walked the academy halls, looking at the photos of graduating classes. The newest ones showed more diverse faces, more women, more people who looked like the communities they'd serve. Change was happening at every level. Back in the classroom, they played real body camera footage from recent stops, examples of officers doing things right. The recruits watched as officers handled tough situations with respect and professionalism, turning potential conflicts into positive interactions. Your badge isn't just a symbol of authority, the agent told them. It's a symbol of trust. And trust has to be earned every single day, with every single interaction. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Near the end of the session, an older recruit spoke up. I switched careers to become an officer because of the changes I saw in my neighborhood this past year, he shared. I saw officers becoming part of the community, not just policing it. The agent ended with a simple exercise. He asked each recruit to write down one word describing what kind of officer they wanted to be. As they shared their answers, fair, trustworthy, respectful, he felt hopeful about the future of law enforcement. After the class, standing in the parking lot, the agent and the former traffic stop officer watched the recruits leave. Think they got the message? The officer asked, The agent nodded, noticing how these young recruits walked with purpose, not just power. As the sun set behind the academy building, casting a golden light across the grounds, both men knew that while their story had started with one wrong traffic stop, it had grown into something much more important, a new way of thinking about what it means to protect and serve.